Good afternoon. It's time for another little spot of George Herbert. Nothing better, I think, to pass the time. Now, The Pilgrimage, a longer, more ambitious poem. It is quite an important poem, I think, for George Herbert. Drury, in his book Music at Midnight, devotes quite an extensive analysis to it, which I won't read all of now, but I would strongly recommend to you. A pilgrimage is, of course, a journey undertaken to a place of religious significance with the aim of either undertaking a particular religious obligation or perhaps to gain a particular favour from God. Pilgrimages in the Middle Ages were very, very popular. One thinks of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, describing the journey of a group of pilgrims to Canterbury to visit the shrine of Thomas Becket, to perhaps gain ask for his prayers to God to bless a particular undertaking, perhaps as maybe a business undertaking or a marriage, or to ask for healing if you were sick. Interestingly, Herbert, I think I think he would have known his Chaucer, because the house he stayed in before he took up his priesthood or his job as priest at Bemerton was home to the widowed mother of George Herbert's stepfather, Sir John Danvers. Sir John Danvers had married Herbert's mother, Magdalen Herbert, and after her death, in order to provide for George Herbert before he could take up his post as priest at Bemerton, he was invited to stay with Danvers's mother at Dauncey House, which is in Wiltshire. And this lady, and it's worth reading Drury's account of her, apparently had Chaucer at her fingers' ends, to quote John Aubrey. So Herbert may well have known. In fact, I think it's highly likely he would have known Chaucer, would have been very familiar with the ideas of pilgrimage in the Canterbury Tales. In fact, pilgrimages are absolute, form some of the most important metaphors underlying very significant works of literature. Dante's journey to find salvation. Philip Sidney uses uses the idea of a pilgrimage, and of course the most famous pilgrimage narrative probably in English literature is the Pilgrims Progress. The Pilgrims Progress by John Bunyan, which was written I think about 50 years after Herbert died. So Herbert would have known his pilgrimage literature, and it's interesting to see the approach he takes to it. So let's have a read. The Pilgrimage. I travelled on, seeing the hill where lay my expectation. A long it was and weary way. The gloomy cave of desperation I left on the one, and on the other side the rock of pride. And so I came to Fancy's meadows strowed with many a flower. Fain would I here have made abode, but I was quickened by my hour. So to Care's copse I came, and there got through with much ado. This led me to the wild of passion, which some call the wold, the wasted place, but sometimes rich. Here was I robbed of all my gold, save one good angel which a friend had tied close to my side. At length I got unto the gladsome hill, where lay my hope, where lay my heart, and climbing still, when I had gained the brow and top, a lake of brackish waters on the ground was all I found. With that abashed, and struck with many a sting of swarming fears, I fell and cried, Alas, my king, can both the way and end be tears? Yet, taking heart, I rose, and then perceived I was deceived. my hill was further. So I flung away, yet heard a cry just as I went. None goes that way and lives. If that be all, said I, after so foul a journey, death is fair, and but a chair. So as we can see, it is a narrative of a journey, and it is based around the image of climbing a hill. Now, hills in the Bible are very important. You have the hill of Calvary. I shall try and change this into a colour you can read. Calvary, which is the hill where Christ was crucified. You also had Mount Sinai, where Sinai, where Moses was given the 10 Commandments by God. So in this context, in this poem, we are seeing these hills very much in the back of the speaker's mind. I think in terms of ideas it's fairly straightforward. It's much less metaphorically intricate and rich than some of Herbert's other poems, but I'll explain a few of the perhaps knotty, difficult ideas for you. What's interesting is the way it starts. The journey has clearly been going on for some time. I travelled on. Herbert gives us no context here of the journey when it started, or how it started, or where he's been before this poem began, and I think it lends a rather splendid sense of urgency, perhaps of determination to the poem. The fact that the third word is I travelled on, implying that the determination to complete this pilgrimage. And the hill, my expectation, what the thing I was seeking. Now, I think what's interesting is, as we should know by now with Herbert, that what people seek is rarely actually what is best for them, or perhaps what God has in mind. So from the very start of the poem, this word, where lay my expectation, we must expect some degree of deception or self-delusion here. I think it's worth looking at the way this poem is constructed. It's a really splendid bit of artistry in terms of, look at this use of all of these caesuras in the first line or two. That sort of I travelled on, seeing the hill. The more sort of those of you who subscribe to dreadful things like the affective fallacy will tell me that that sounds like a sort of plodding, lumbering tread of someone weary but determined to continue with their journey. And I think the very clever use of enjambment here, where lay my expectation, perhaps that feeling of sort of looking up, of that sudden movement between one end, the end of the first line into the second line. The third line is an example of a rather splendid poetic technique called, wait for it, hen dis. Now this is really rather marvellous. Hendiadys is where you, instead of saying it was a long and weary way, you separate the adjectives out. A long it was and weary way, perhaps again emphasising the gruelling and arduous, A-R-D-U-O-U-S, nature of the journey. Now, Herbert, in this poem, even though it's very biblical, I think he's also drawing on his classical learning here. We have a rather nice allusion in the last two lines of the first stanza, and this allusion is to the story of Scylla and Charybdis. Now, Scylla and Charybdis, I shall write the name here, Scylla, S-C-Y-L-L-A, and Charybdis, C-H-A-R-Y-B-D-I-S, were terrible dangers faced by this fellow here, Odysseus, as he journeyed home with his men on it, trying to get home after the Trojan War. Now, Scylla, I can never remember which is which, and I don't think it really matters, although I'm sure you'll all disagree with me. Scylla and Charybdis were, on the one hand, a whirlpool, such as we can see here, and on the other hand, some terribly dangerous rocks, a shoal of shallow and dangerous waters, which in classical mythology were described as a six-headed sea monster. And you can see the monster here gnashing its teeth at poor old Odysseus as he tries to steer a safe passage between the two. So it is an image of being caught between two perilous dangers. In fact, it is the origin of the phrase caught between a rock and a hard place. So interestingly, in a very biblical poem, Herbert is drawing on some very classical imagery, some classical allusions to illustrate his point. And so back to the poem. The poem continues with some rather lovely imagery. The Fancy's meadow. Fancy here means a place of unconstrained delight. Perhaps if we take fancy as meaning all your heart desires. It's a meadow, strode, an old past tense form of the we'd probably say strewn now, S-T-R-E-W-N, completely covered with beautiful flowers, images of a sensual delights. The word fain means dearly would I here have made abode. He desperately wants to stop here, but I was quickened by my hour, and so to care's copse I came. Now you'll have to excuse, I've sort of managed to fail to cross out a footnote, very sorry. Now copse here does not mean anything to do with police academy or the police. Copse is what we would now spell it, C-O-P-S-E, and it means a thicket, a small, dense, T-H-I-C-K-E-T, thicket, a small or dense stand of trees. So lots of, again, another nice image, another nice metaphor here, and again a very apt metaphor that with care, with trouble and worry, you do sometimes feel trapped. Again, a nice perhaps allusion to that saying, you can't see the wood for the trees. That means when you're so bewildered, so overwhelmed by everything around you, you can't see the bigger picture. So he got through there with much ado, with great trouble and with great hard work. The wild of passion. It's a wild place, or a wasted place. Again, a very common image of a wild here has lots of meanings actually. It's a common image in the Bible for something which is a deserted place, a wild and empty place, a little bit like the heath on which King Lear goes quite so mad. But it's also a nice pun, isn't it? It's not just a wild place, it's also the wildnesses, the unconstrained anger and of passion. And in the next line, as we can see, it's not just a physical journey but an emotional one. So we've gone through pleasure, we've gone past care, we've managed to fight our way through care, and now into this open wild place of passion, where it's very easy to not so much get lost as you would in a thicket, but to find yourself aimlessly, pointlessly wandering. Now this wold word in the third stanza could mean an elevated passage of open country. For Herbert, living near the Salisbury Plain, he might have had that sort of wild, open, empty countryside in mind. I wonder if there's perhaps a pun on world as well. Of course, the world, the flesh, and worldly passions, worldly delights being closely associated with this image. A wasted place, but sometimes rich. This is a rather nice line. On the one hand, sometimes rich, it could perhaps allude to the fact that the world was once home to paradise, sometimes in the sense of in the past, and also that sometimes that suffering can be beneficial. Here was I robbed of all my gold. I wonder if we're being invited. Well, I don't wonder, I'm pretty certain we're being invited to think about the prodigal son here, the parable that Jesus tells of the young man who goes off and with his inheritance from his father and spends all of his father's money on wine, women and song, which perhaps again would fit rather nicely with passion. It's very easy to spend all of your money on earthly delights. The good angel, Drury tells me, is a coin, a type of gold coin bearing the emblem of the Archangel St. Michael, a spirit to guide. So we've worked our way through several different emotional states, and now time to move on to the next few. And having, yes, as I said, worked our way through these the trials and tribulations of life, he reaches the gladsome hill, the image of the holy hill of Jerusalem, or of Zion, or perhaps also the image of Calvary, as we've said before. One of these, he doesn't specify which hill it is, and I think it's because he wants us to think of all of these different biblical hills. Where lay my hope, where lay my heart? There's so much, and I haven't really discussed it yet, but there's so much in this poem to consider in terms of close, really detailed use of language. There's been some beautiful alliteration so far. We might say here we've got this rather splendid use of anaphora, lending that sense of urgency to it. Where lay my hope, where lay my heart, and climbing still. And this I think is rather splendid, because he changes from this anaphora, this feeling of urgency, to this anticipation which builds over the last three lines of the stanza. And just as we suggested at the start, that if you find expectation in a Herbert poem, you know that the human is going to be disappointed. He finds nothing more than a lake of brackish waters at the top. Now, brackish waters are waters which are slightly salty, so it's very hard for anything to grow in them. Sort of swamp-like waters as well. The image of a swamp will be memorably revived by Bunyan in the image of the slough of despond, this swamp of despair. That's Bunyan there. So, I mean, for anyone who has climbed any hills, they will know very well what this experience is like. You climb your mountain and you think you can see the top, and then you reach, and it's a false summit, and you have yet more to climb. And I think this is very effective on Herbert's part. He's yet again calling on the landscape of the Salisbury Plain, of its rolling hills, and its wild and rather marshy and boggy places, to illustrate to the people of his parish the ideas which he is exploring in the poem, using their own shared experience. And then the poem changes. Suddenly a note of panic emerges, and I think it's well worth noting what he does with his with the ends of the lines. With that abashed and struck, abashed means abashed in this sense doesn't mean embarrassed, but I think it means confounded, in the sense of overthrown by or defeated. So again, we can look at the wonderful use of sound. And struck with many a sting of swarming fears. Have we got the image of flies and midges swarming around us? A biblical plague of flies, perhaps. The brackish waters in the previous stanza might have alluded to tears, salt tears. And all of the movement of these first two lines of the penultimate stanza, with that abashed and struck with many a sting of swarming fears, I fell and cried, alas, my king. This is, in many ways, the sort of emotional, darkest place of the poem. For all of the troubles of fighting your way through temptation and despair, it is fear which causes the speaker to be most confounded. Can both the way and end be tears? So I think the idea with this is really rather clever. The way is to be, for the Christian on their way through life, the idea of the way being full of tears is understandable. The Christian image of life is often one of withstanding hardship, tears of suffering, but the end to be tears as well. Well, not only the journey but also the destination can be tears, not only life but death, tears as well. And then Herbert, in a way that he rarely does in his poems, he develops the narrative. Yet taking heart I rose, and then perceived I was deceived. And I like the way that between this stanza and the next one, the sentence goes on. He is indicating that the journey hasn't finished. This moment of despair that we've had just here is dispelled as he understands that his hill was further. That image of the false summit. He's reached his expectation and now understands that there is more to go on. To fling away is a fantastic image of setting off yet more energetically, and then the poem becomes rather more mysterious and perhaps even eerie, because this rather dark image, yet I heard a cry. What sort of a cry is this? Do you find it a cry of sorrow, a cry of exclamation, a cry to attract his attention? I don't know. I think it could be any of those. None goes that way and lives. This is very much the final stages of journey through life. And then this rather splendid last three lines. If that be all, said I, after so foul a journey, death is fair. I can't help but think, Herbert might have had Macbeth in mind with that line. Fair is foul and foul is fair, hover through the fog and filthy air, which the witches say at the start of Macbeth's tragedy. Yet for Herbert, it's the end of his life. Another example of antithesis, which is one of Herbert's favourite techniques. Fair, not only in the sense of lovely and beautiful, but also perhaps just. The final line of the poem is really quite baffling, and I think it has foxed quite a lot of readers over time. Certainly foxed me once or twice. I wonder if it's an image of repose. That is rest. R-E-P-O-S-E. Other readers might see it as a chair, as in the sort of sedan chair which aristocrats would have been carried around in order so they didn't have to walk in the mud and filth of Jacobean streets. Is it a place of rest and comfort? And in any case, it is an image of consolation. It is an image that, having fought and struggled his way through his life, all this limping, staggering effects of the first part of the poem, at the end, and but a chair, is a consoling image. I think it's rather important that Herbert ends the poem on an open vowel, chair. He doesn't end with a consonant. There's this feeling that the journey is going to go on, but in a more blessed, more peaceful way. So our question is, how do we interpret this poem? It certainly seems to fit with much of Herbert's imagery of restlessness, of never feeling able to settle into one mode of living. Herbert was, of course, a man who for a long time in his life was unsure about the direction he was to take. He was an aristocratic man of remarkable intellectual and academic gifts. He held a very senior post at the University of Cambridge, which, if he had played his cards right, could have led to a very prestigious post at court. But he seemed to be able. He seemed to be able, but he failed to exploit that because by taking on holy orders, by becoming a priest, it meant he couldn't then go and take his place and have the prestige of being at court. So I wonder if this poem is quite autobiographical. On the other hand, the poem has been criticised for its flatness of tone, for the lack of imagination in some of the imagery. Certainly there's none of the restless intensity of something like the collar here. So I leave it up to you to make your mind up about this poem. Is it a moving evocation of of a journey of spiritual crisis, of never quite feeling like you're ever going to reach the goal that you set yourself, or is it a rather perfunctory poem which perhaps doesn't deserve to be rated alongside Herbert's greatest works?